We are a peaceful people, struggling we struggle, and we don't look for trouble, just ask around.
Abolition of slavery, which was an adjunct of the capitalist system, was never intended to be total. In the first place, a period of indentureship was introduced. Now, according to my simple mind, one is apprenticed if one is going to learn the job which one proposes to undertake. Is that not right? You have an apprentice carpenter, an apprentice mason, an apprentice mechanic. Now, the slaves have spent all their time working in the sugar plantations, working in the sugar mills, doing all the work in the house, and you know they did sometimes all the work. All the work. All the work. Working in the house, working in the fields. Now, what further period of apprenticeship is necessary? Isn't that to do injustice to their own language to suggest that a man who has spent his lifetime doing the job he's going to continue to do needs a period of apprenticeship? And then they said, well, there's going to be a 40-and-a-half-hour week. During those 40-and-a-half hours, you give free labor to the former plantation owners. And then the rest of time is yours. And so, there was a man called Bean who owned a sugar plantation at Richmond on the Essequibo coast. He was magistrate, justice of the peace, everything. He didn't like this thing. And then there was a fellow called Damon, a black man. He was so presumptuous as to think that abolition meant abolition, and all this talk about apprenticeship was hooey and poppycock. They taught him a lesson. They taught him a lesson, comrades. They captured him and a few others. They completed the public buildings on the 5th of August, and they hung them outside there in October. And it was clear. They charged him with treason. He had no arms. He made no speech talking about the overthrow of the state. The evidence depended upon the testimony of a deaf planter who claimed to have had a conversation with Damon. Listen, nowadays I hear they are investigating secret executions in the Cameroons. Would to God we could get back some of them to investigate. The execution of a man on the testimony of a self-confessed deaf who said he had a conversation with him. And what was the conversation? He claimed he asked, "Who is the captain?" He wants to talk to the captain, and Damon said, I am the captain. And on that, Damon was executed, and some of the others were sent to Australia. I wonder what has happened to their descendants. And it was not until 1838 that the apprenticeship system came to an end. You notice I say the apprenticeship system came to an end. I didn't say slavery came to an end. The apprenticeship system came to an end. For slavery was part of a system based on the exploitation of others. If you can't do it by direct labor, you do it by other means. Well, at first, they tried direct labor, so they went off, I think, to Madeira. And that explains the Portuguese section of our population. And then they went off to China, and that explains, or Hong Kong rather, in Kowloon. And that explains the Chinese part. But it is alleged they found them unsuitable for the work on the sugar plantations, and then they went off to India. And that explains the Indian part of our population. You had indentured labor. Now, what on earth did that mean? It meant paying starvation wages. It meant corralling people into lodges under the most inhuman and insanitary conditions. And it meant also the capacity and ability to inflict corporal punishment. And right into the period of indentured labor, one found that the hooks for hanging human beings remained on exhibition and also in use. And I say that a rose by any other name would have as many thorns. So what you really had was a change of the name, not a change of the substance. There was the need, because very interestingly, British Guyana, as it then was the most profitable sugar producing of the English-speaking colonies. In addition, from Kitty up, was producing cotton until we reached the position that we were the #2 cotton producer in the world. So you needed cheap labor, and so it happened. Now, another error we must not commit is to believe that even the formal abolition of slavery that took place in the entire region. For it was not until the 1860s that the United States of America, who had so gallantly fought for their own independence against the same slave owners, cousins in Britain, abolished slavery, and that after a civil war. And there were later dates at which slavery was abolished in various parts of Latin America, and the rest of the Spanish or former Spanish colonies. One thing you must give the British is that in the past at least, they tend to move one step ahead of the others. Before we reflect, not on our achievements, you've heard of our achievements, you know of our achievements. Before we reflect on the system that came after the abolition of slavery, and incidentally the Jamaicans have a point. For the Jamaicans, 1834 is of little or no significance. The significant date for them is 1838, after the period of apprenticeship had come to an end. Maybe they were less revolutionary than we were. They didn't have their demons, though they had their maroons. But before we reflect on the system that came hereafter or thereafter, let me just give you a little detail. Towards the time of the abolition of slavery, when the consciences of the British legislators and public, we were told in the history books which we had to read, had been stirred, had been already stirred, in July the 9th, on July the 9th, 1821, a local guide was published reminding persons that no slave is permitted to walk after 8 at night. Unless he has a pass or a lantern. Must have a pass to show or a lantern to show his face, perhaps, otherwise his face was too dark to be seen. No. On pain of being put in the stock and the owner being obliged to pay $2 for his or her release, exclusive of the charge for boarding such slave. Now tell me, what's the difference between him and a hog? Or him and a goat? Or him and a jackal? Or him and a horse? The only difference is how much you pay. And perhaps when you look at 1821 and compare it with 1984, what with devaluation and the basket and all that sort of thing, $2 would be somewhat more than the $20 I understand you have to pay now. That was the slave who was brought here to be modified by the influence of Christianity. But in the stocks, if he walks at night after 8 without a pass or a lantern, they might have added that if he smiled, it would be all right. Now, sugar continued dominant in this country thereafter. In the case of the descendants of Africans who tended to be urbanized in the villages, the punishment for them was easy and condign. Flood their villages, destroy their crops, and force them into impecuniosity. In the case of the Indians, rule them with a heavy hand and ride them with whip and spur. Promise them a shilling a day when you are picking them up in India, but give them 4 shillings a day when you bring them to British Guyana. The Indians were human beings too. And there was strife starting from the 1840s right through and culminating in the 1948 resistance of Enmore, which we commemorate each year in June. If one is frightfully academic, one would be inclined to differentiate between slavery and indentured labor. But the conditions of living were hardly different. The disrespect for human dignity was identical, and a hair's breadth separated the economic potential of either group during this terrible period. All right. By 1953, as a result of a national struggle, when it was recognized that the trade union movement alone was not capable of carrying the fight to the imperialists, the struggle on the political front developed more fully. I'm not suggesting that there was no struggle on the political front, but I would say that by 1953, the struggle on the political front developed more fully, and there was a greater coordination of effort between the trade unions and the political grouping. What happened? A constitution was suspended. Why? Because they say we were going communist. Now, we are told that it is of the essence of democracy that the people should be permitted to choose the form of government which they want. But I am reminded of a certain head of state, not in the Caribbean, who called together the 3 persons who were to choose a vice-chancellor of a particular university. And he said, gentlemen, you may choose anyone you like as vice-chancellor, provided it's one of these 2. So far as the British are concerned, you're free to choose your form of government, provided it is acceptable to the British. That was their philosophy in 1953. What is their present philosophy now? We shall see later. In 1966, we gained independence. Was slavery abolished in 1966? I say no. was in 1970, we became a cooperative republic. Was slavery abolished? I say no. Because now slavery engulfs not merely Guyana or British Guyana. It engulfs the entire developing world, particularly the ex-colonies. In the same way as the slaves and indentured laborers were brought from their respective homes for the profit of a system dominated by those who own the plantation, even so, those who now superintend the economies of the capitalist world look upon our countries as being obliged to operate for their profits and benefits. Of course, we do not go around in physical shackles and chains. Of course, no longer can they hang us up by hooks. No longer can they make our mothers abort by beating them. But certainly they can interfere with the future of our economy and the future of our children by the manipulation of prices and the manipulation of the economic and financial system internationally. But in the same way, as people like Damon saw a new light and a new possibility when there was a formal declaration with respect to the abolition of slavery, in the same way as some of the leaders of slave rebellions sought to set up arrangements with similar groups in Suriname, and those in Burma sought to set up arrangements with similar groups in Demerara. Even so, I think a possibility of our way out of the impending, threatening, or actual slavery is a greater cooperation between the countries of the South or the developing countries. And let us understand, comrades, that the ruthlessness of the slave masters was physical. But the ruthlessness of the slave masters today is no less great. There has been set up an economic and financial system which was relevant in the 40s. And those who run it refuse to budge. Another aspect with respect to the survival of slavery is to be found in the mind. Some of us have freed ourselves. Some of us think independently. Some of us are willing to carve niches for our country. Some of us are bent on the establishment of a socialist society in Guyana. But what about others? What about those who hark back to ancient days and, like some of the slaves, argue how much they are worth? When compensation was being paid to the slave owners, there were some slaves who, though they had no monetary or financial interest in that compensation, who argued on behalf of their masters that their masters should be paid more for them because they were a better class of shacklers. How reminiscent of that attitude is the attitude of those who, instead of staying to build Guyana, say that they are worth more and migrate to be paid less in a lower and a dehumanizing job. How many senior civil servants have I not seen operating as bellhops in New York? How many erstwhile managers do I not see as baggage boys in the hotels I go to in various parts of the world? They are worth more, even though they have to subject themselves to the dehumanization of being bellhops and baggage boys. And again, there was a very interesting argument which arose during the period of emancipation. For during those 4 years, the slaves were supposed to be fed by the masters. So many plantains per day. But some slaves, not all, some slaves argue that in place of plantain, they wanted wheaten flour. How reminiscent is it of the servile mentality which has survived among some of us 150 years after the formal abolition of slavery. Let us understand finally, comrades, that not only has slavery been a canker in our society regardless of the ethnics, not only have all of us suffered from slavery, but all of us have suffered from the most pernicious effects of slavery, the effects upon the mind. Don't you notice sometimes when you bring in a foreign contractor, and you have a foreign contractor or consultant, the work is completed on time when you use an equally competent local contractor? Some people's wife get babies. Other people's cousin got Bigfoot. Other people's mother just take in. Other people just get telegram that a cousin got flu. And the job is never completed on time. One of the things that slavery put into our minds, engraved in our minds, is our innate inferiority. But in the same way as I contend that it was the rebellious nature of the slaves that brought the abolition about, in the same way I contend it's the rebellions of the slaves that made their masters freedom, in the same way as I contend that it was the slaves' desire to be free once again. Even so, I contend that today, whether it is on the economic front, the production front, or the social front, freedom, real freedom, will only be ours if we determine that we shall be free. And at a conscious level, wipe out these legacies of slavery and take an oath today that never again shall we be slaves to man or mouse.
Comrade President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, Comrade Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham.